Now here's the beauty of test-driven development. This route handler that we created is 100% covered by tests. So now we can easily refactor this function, come up with a better implementation, run all the tests, and if all these tests pass, we would be confident that we didn't break anything during this refactoring. So the first thing I want to modify here is how we validate the input. Instead of these two lines, I want to validate using joy. So to save time, I'm going to go to our genre model. Here we have this validate function. I'm going to copy this into our returned module. So let's put it here at the end. And then rename this to validate return. Also, let's rename the parameter to request. Now in this request, we want to have two properties. One is customer ID, and this should be an object ID, okay? So a required object ID. Now let's duplicate this. The second property is movie ID. So this is our validate function. Now let's go back to our genres module, our genres route. This is how we validate using joy. So let's copy these two lines as well. Back to our returns module. So we want to replace these first two lines like this. So here we need to change validate to validate return, give it request.body, and the rest is good. Now finally, because we're using joy in this module, we need to import it on the top. So constant joy, we set this to require joy. Okay, now let's go back to the terminal. All our tests are passing. Here you go, beautiful. So we didn't break anything with this refactoring. However, you might be asking, Mosh, what was the point of this refactoring? We replaced two lines with another two lines, so we didn't really make the code shorter. That is true. However, note that we have these two lines in a lot of route handlers. This is repetitive. We can move this into a middleware function, just like how we check authentication using a middleware function. So right here, I'm going to create a middleware function, and then we'll move this to a different file. So let's define validate. We set this to a function that takes three parameters: request, response, and next. Okay. Now let's move these two lines inside this function. Now here's the tricky part. This first line is different in each route handler. So here we are validating the return objects. In another route handler, we're validating, let's say, a genre or a movie. So we need to be able to dynamically pass a validator function here. To fix this problem, instead of passing request, response, and next here, we're going to pass validator, which is a function. And then we need to change this implementation. So instead of directly executing this code, we're going to return a middleware function to give to Express. Express will call that middleware function as part of processing a request. So here we return a function that takes request, response, and next. Now we move this logic inside this function. And finally, replace validate return with validator. So the function that we pass here dynamically, we use that, we call that function and pass the body of the request as an argument. Now, if we have an error, we're going to return a 400 response. Otherwise, we're going to call next. So now we can easily use this when setting up our route. So here we want to pass an array of middleware functions. First, we want to make sure that the client is logged in. Next, we validate the request. And as a validator, we pass a reference to our validate return function. And after that, we have our route handler. Again, because we have fully covered this function with tests, we can save the changes and go back to terminal to see if our application is still working. You can see all these 37 tests are passing. Beautiful. So finally, let's move this function to a separate file. Back in the project, let's go to the middleware folder, add a new file called validate.js. Now, back to our returns module. Let's cut all this code and move it here. And finally, we replace this with module.exports. Very simple. Now finally, we need to go back to our returns module and import this validate middleware on the top. So let's import it here. Require. Let's go to the middleware folder and import the validate module. Get the result and store it here. This is a better and cleaner implementation. Once again, save the changes, back in the terminal, all tests are passing. Excellent. Now, with this new validate function, we can also refactor the existing route handlers and remove the validation logic that we have repeated in almost every route handler. But I leave that to you as an exercise. Make sure first to write a test for each route handler you're going to modify. At a minimum, you should test the validation in that function. All right, so this was our first refactoring, but we're not done yet. In the next lecture, we're going to continue cleaning up this function.